And good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me once again for our weekly Bhagavad-gita virtual satsang. For those of you who are new to the satsang, welcome and thank you very much for coming. My name is Hari-kirtana, same actually as last week. And if you are interested in delving deeper into the Bhagavad-gita, then hopefully you have come to the right place. My mission is to share my understanding of the Gita and my experience of the Gita with you. My understanding as I have received it from my own teachers, and my experience as I've tried to live according to the text. And we have a usual routine that involves a little bit of housekeeping. The first item of which is to make sure you can hear me. So please raise your hands. Those of you who are participating in real time, thank you very, very much. Okay, I feel very assured that you can all hear me. So welcome to you all, and welcome to all of you who I know will be joining us in the next few minutes, as there are always a few of you who come in a few minutes, and welcome to all of you who are watching after the fact in the recorded version. Right. We'll make the rest of our housekeeping official now that we know raising hands works. You can adjust your audio settings as well as your viewing options with the controls in the upper right-hand corner. You need not worry about your microphone or video camera. You can see and hear me, but I cannot see or hear you. You can type into the Q&A box if you have a question or a comment, and I am always anxious to hear both of those. So if you would be kind enough to type something into the Q&A box just to assure yourselves that I will see your questions and comments, and frankly, just to reassure me that, or for me to be reassured. 1, 2, 3, Kate. Thank you, Kate. All right, here we go. Last week, we covered chapter 4, verses 16 through 23. Continuing with knowledge of action, we spoke about action in inaction and inaction in action, one of my favorite phrases from the Bhagavad-gita. We spoke about how one can engage in action without generating a reaction to their actions if one understands action properly. And just to make sure, and also because the verses we covered last week are really very directly connected to the verses we're going to cover this week, I'm just going to run through last week's verses again, not with a whole lot of commentary since we did that last week, but just as a refresher so that you will see how the cluster of verses that we covered last week is referenced by the cluster of verses that we're going to cover tonight. We also spoke last week about the life-changing magic of tidying up, of relinquishing our sense of proprietorship over extraneous things that are not really helping us in our spiritual life, and not even so much giving up things, but giving up that sense of possessiveness over those things, because that's actually more important than giving up the thing itself, which may not be necessary in order to advance in our spiritual lives. We talked about how to burn up your karma, how to head it off at the pass, because action properly performed not only does not generate any reaction, but it actually burns up the seed that was planted by our past actions that would ultimately fructify into a reaction had we not burned it up. So we'll do a quick review of 16 through 23. Tonight's program, knowledge of sacrifice. So we left off with the idea of performing action as a sacrifice, and now Krishna is going to elaborate on the varieties of sacrifice, different techniques of sacrifice, objectives of sacrifice, and here you're going to see how we are pivoting even more in the direction of the eightfold path of mystic yoga that is described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So here in this section of karma yoga, the techniques of yoga described in Patanjali's eightfold system are going to fall under the category of actions one can perform and varieties of sacrifice. Okay, so this will be chapter 4, verses 24 through 33. But first, a recap of last week's verses. Oops. All right, here we go. These are verses 16 through 23. Even greatly learned sages are perplexed by questions about what action and inaction are. Now I shall explain to you what action is, knowing which you will be freed from all misfortune. The path of action is complex. Therefore, one should know how to make distinctions between ethical actions, iniquitous actions, and liberating actions. In human society, one who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is endowed with the power of discernment. Such a yogi remains situated in transcendence while engaged in all manner of activities. Those who are wise say that one whose every endeavor is free from the motivation to enjoy the fruits of their endeavors is understood to be a sage whose reactions to their actions have been burned up by the fire of perfect knowledge. Having given up all attachment to such fruitive results, ever satisfied and independent, one engages in inaction, even while engaged in all manner of activities. So I'll stop here for just a second. The idea of fruits of action, just to review this a bit, this phrase comes up a lot when we speak about karma. The reaction to our actions are compared to fruits that grow on a tree. But before you have the fruits, you first have to plant the seed, and then the seed has to take root, and then there's a sprout that comes out of the ground, and then the stem grows, or the trunk grows, branches happen, leaves happen, the fruit begins to form, and finally there's a ripened fruit that may be bitter or sweet, depending on whether the reaction to our actions are favorable or unfavorable. So this phrase, fruitive activities, means an activity that is performed with the idea of enjoying that reaction, the fruits of one's actions. And here, Krishna is telling us that by giving up this attachment to enjoying the fruits of our activities, one can take the first step in acting in a way that is truly free, that is to say, free from reactions to our actions, or liberating actions. So here we have three kinds of actions: ethical actions, actions in harmony with cosmic order that bring about a positive reaction or a harmonious reaction; iniquitous actions, actions that are in disharmony with cosmic order and therefore produce an unfortunate or disharmonious result. And then finally, liberating action, action that does not bind one to a good or bad reaction at all, a transcendental activity. Free, so now I continue. free from the desire to enjoy fruits of actions, with mind and senses controlled by spiritual intelligence, having relinquished all sense of proprietorship over one's possessions, and acting only as needed to maintain the basic necessities of one's body, one remains free from sinful reactions. So here we're starting to get a few of the principles of niyama, of the personal observances of yoga in Patanjali's system. Tapasya, contentment, etc. In fact, the very next verse, content with gain that comes of its own accord, unperturbed by duality or envy, accepting both success and failure with a steady mind. Such a person is never entangled by reactions to the actions they perform. For a liberated soul who is thus situated in transcendental knowledge, free from attachment, and whose every action is an act of sacrifice, all reactions to their actions are systematically vanquished. So that was our last verse from last week, which brings us to the idea that the proper understanding of the different categories of action and how one can act in such a way as to not generate a reaction to their actions is in the category of transcendental knowledge. That is, knowledge of how to move through the world in such a way as to liberate oneself from the influence of the world, to be in the world but not affected by the world or of the world, etc. And every action for such a person is an act of sacrifice. So now we're going to get into the varieties of sacrifice. And in this section, depending on the translation that you have, you may find that the verses are grouped together differently than the way I have laid them out. I noticed when I was looking at the various editions of the Bhagavad-gita that I reference when I prepare for these sessions with you, I saw that different translators grouped a few of the verses together in different ways. So it all will end up being the same cluster of verses. Not to worry if in your edition of the Gita you don't have it laid out exactly the way I've laid it out this evening. So I'm going to run through the translation of the verses, then we'll go back and go into each one in detail, and we'll chant a few of them. So here we go. Chapter 4, verse 24. In such acts of sacrifice, the instrument by which the offering is made, the act of the offering itself, the one who makes the offering, and the fire that consumes the offering are all of the same spiritual nature. Thus, one who is absorbed in perfect meditation on such spiritual actions attains perfect spiritual consciousness. Verse 25. Some yogis worship divinities through sacrificial offerings. Others offer themselves in the fire of sacrifice to the absolute truth. Verse 26. Some monastics offer their senses, such as the sense of hearing, into the fire of complete self-discipline. Others, householders, offer the objects of the senses, such as sound, into the fire of the senses. Verse 27. Still others, being motivated by the desire for self-realization, offer the functions of all of their organs, along with the actions of the breath of life, into the fire of yoga, which is kindled by perfect mental discipline. Verse 28. Some sacrifice their worldly possessions through acts of charity. Some sacrifice material comforts through acts of austerity. Some perform sacrifices of the eightfold path of mysticism, and some perform sacrifices by accepting severe vows of asceticism, acquiring self-knowledge through engagement in scriptural study. Still, text 29. Still others practice control of the breath, offering their incoming breath into their outgoing breath, and their outgoing breath into their ingoing breath. And others sacrifice the act of eating and suspend their breath altogether, thus sacrificing their own vital force. Text 30. Though engaged in different methods, all these performers understand the purpose of sacrifice and become purified by such performances. Having tasted the nectar of sacrificial remnants, they advance toward the supreme and eternal truth. Text 31. O best of the Kuru dynasty, one cannot live happily in this world without engaging in sacrifice. What to speak of the next? Text 32. Thus, various kinds of sacrifices emanate from the mouth of sacred texts. They are all born of action. Knowing them in this way, you shall be liberated. Text 33. O scorcher of foes, a sacrifice of knowledge is greater than a sacrifice of worldly possessions, for all acts of sacrifice culminate in knowledge. All right. Hi, Jess. And hi, Mary. All right. Thank you and welcome to all of you who joined us as our proceedings began. Those are the verses. We're about to go through them in detail, but before I do, does anyone have a question about just the verses themselves? If you do, please go ahead and pop something into the Q&A box. I will make sure I take a look over there just to see what's coming. Meanwhile, I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so this is the last verse from last week. We'll chant this verse, and then we will move into the next verse, the very next verse, 24. Here we go. I chant, you chant back. Gatta sangasya muktasya jnanavastita chetasaha jagyaya charata karma samagram pravaliyate. Now, for those of you who are maybe new to chanting the transliterated Sanskrit, let me just go back over this for a second and explain a little bit about the diacritical marks. So the dot under the N in Sangasya indicates that the N will be pronounced with the middle of your tongue up against the roof of your mouth midway back. So it's a little more of a nasal sound than an N sound with your tongue up against your teeth. The tilde over the N in the first word of the second line, nya sound. And the bars over the vowels indicate a very long or open sound. Now the J, you might have expected that to be pronounced jnana as opposed to jnana. The pronunciation may vary a little bit according to which region of India you learn your Sanskrit in. But as a general rule, the J followed by the N with a tilde is pronounced more of a harder, almost hard G sound, gya, as opposed to jinya. You may hear it pronounced both ways, but I have always understood from my teachers that it is jnana, which means knowledge. The dot under the H at the end of chetasaha indicates that one should bounce the vowel behind the H back, a little echo. Jagya, the Y in the third line, now that instead of yajna, takes on a J sound, jagya. And I suppose someone who has the time or expertise could explain why, but trust me. There you go. Translation: for a liberated soul who is thus situated in transcendental knowledge, free from attachment, and whose every action is an act of sacrifice, all reactions to their actions are systematically vanquished. So this is really good news if you are interested in getting rid of your karma. Now you know how. You can become a liberated soul situated in transcendental knowledge. All you have to do is become free from attachment and make every action an act of sacrifice, and all of your reactions will be systematically vanquished. Easy peasy. All right. We've read the translations from this section, so now let's get into some translations and commentary. But first, we're going to chant another verse. So this is now the first verse, 24, for tonight. I chant, and you chant back. Brahmarpanam Brahmahavir Brahmagnau Brahmanahutam Brahmaiva Tena Gantavyam Brahma Karma Samadhina. Notice the word Brahmagnau. These are actually compound words here. So Brahma, Agnau, is actually a variation of Agni, indicating fire. So we'll take this verse apart as we look once again at the translation. In such acts of sacrifice, the instrument by which the offering is made, the act of offering, the offering itself, the one who makes the offering, and the fire that consumes the offering are all of the same spiritual nature. Thus, one who is absorbed in perfect meditation on such acts of sacrifice attains perfect spiritual consciousness. So this is a great example of the non-duality of yoga, insofar as everything involved in a yogic action is of the same spiritual quality. This is essentially a formula for the re-spiritualization of matter. So here's what I mean by this. Let's say you're a yoga teacher, and the purpose of your teaching yoga, your mission in life, is to share transcendental knowledge with the people who come to your yoga class. Well, that's a transcendental activity, to share transcendental knowledge. So to get to the class, I have to take my car. Well, that's the instrument by which the offering is made. I'm going to go and teach my yoga class, and I'm all right, I'm going to get paid for it. But I'm going to use the money to also do things that are only associated with my spiritual life. I'm not going to just try to enjoy the fruits of my actions, but I'll plow that into what I need to be content in my life, and anything above and beyond that gets plowed back into the business of transcendental knowledge, of spreading transcendental knowledge. So it's an act of sacrifice. The act of driving down to the yoga studio is an act of sacrifice, and therefore the instrument, namely my car, which is made of metal and rubber and plastic and cloth and glass, it's made of matter, it's made of material elements. Those material elements regain their original spiritual nature, because remember, the material world is a transformation of spiritual energy. So I'm driving a spiritual car when I go and drive to my yoga class, if I'm not attached to the results of my actions, and the purpose is to make teaching an offering to my conception of the highest truth. So the act of offering, once I get there, the act of teaching, everything that I do in my class, the offering itself, the practice, the one who makes the offering, I get spiritualized. And the fire that consumes the offering, that to whom or to which the offering is being made, all of the same spiritual nature. It doesn't mean that we all become one, that I become one with my students, that I become one with my car, or that I become one with the person whom the sacrifice is being offered to. Everyone still retains all their individual identity. But what's happened is an action that could just as easily be a mundane action now becomes a spiritual action because of the nature of how I've handled it. So think about this. It doesn't have to be teaching yoga. It can be any number of things. Almost anything can be dovetailed in this way in order to turn what might otherwise be a mundane karma-producing action into a liberating spiritual action that spiritualizes everything involved in the action. So think of something. Think of something you do in your life. Just a regular thing. Anything. And see if it's possible for you to transmute everything involved in what you do, the instrument of how you do it, the act of doing it, that which is offered in itself. See if you can figure out how to spiritualize that and how to do it in such a way so that it's an offering that you make without thinking, I'm going to enjoy the results of this for myself. And then if you're absorbed in meditation on the transcendental nature of everyone and everything that's involved in this undertaking, that's spiritual consciousness. That's seeing the material world and everyone in it in their true original spiritual form or context. Any questions about that? Pop them into the Q&A box. So here you have it, the re-spiritualization of matter described in this verse. All right, whoops, come back. We're not there yet. Okay. So moving on to verse number 25, continuing along these lines. Now what we're going to do is get into these different varieties of sacrifice and the different kinds of yogis who are going to be inclined to make different kinds of sacrifice, different sacrifice different things and for different objectives. So here we go. Some yogis worship divinities through sacrificial offerings. So divinities that could be conceptions of demigods. There's all manner of worship of different kinds of conceptions of divine beings in a wide range of cultures and traditions. And you can be a yogi and you can still be a materialist. Normally, when you're interested in gaining a material benefit from worshiping the divinity of your choice, then that would still be yoga, but it would be materialistic yoga. So for example, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, we get into the 3rd chapter. We get a whole long list of different materialistic meditations, essentially. Now, they're really subtle and really scientific on a very, very subtle level, like Dr. Strange level scientific. But the idea is to gain power over elements of material nature in such a way as to be able to do things and get what you want. Or just from the standpoint of karma. You know, you make an offering of some kind and you seek to enjoy the results of that offering. Whereas others, I got you, Kate, others offer themselves in the fire of sacrifice to the absolute truth. So now, in the 2nd sentence, Krishna describes a separate category of yogi, that is, yogis who are interested in understanding the absolute truth. Okay. Question, hold on. All right, I'm gonna echo this back just to make sure I understand the question. If you are detached from the fruits of your actions because you are looking for something, even if it's liberation, isn't that still attachment? I may not be attached to my paycheck and offer most of it away, but if I'm doing so for liberation, aren't I still doing it for the wrong reasons? Good question. So this question comes from Kate, and here's a way to understand this. Basically, the essence of the question, if I understand it correctly, is isn't the desire for liberation still kind of in the category of a material desire or a desire of some kind that's selfish because it's something I want for me? I want to be liberated. I no longer want to have to put up with the material world because it's a drag. Okay. In one sense, yes, if someone is practicing yoga for the sake of being liberated, then that's a personal motive. And the sacrifice being offered does have an ulterior motive. One seeks liberation. Now that's a better motivation than just wanting to enjoy the results of one's actions in a material sense, because to be liberated from karma is better than being entangled in karma. So there's a progression that one goes through in material life, which is that one seeks to act in such a way as to generate good karma. You follow injunctions according to your understanding of universal law, of cosmic order, and you do things that are in harmony with your understanding of cosmic order or with cosmic order itself, whether you understand it or not. You seek to understand how you can act in such a way so that the universe will reciprocate with you by giving you the means by which to enjoy your material life. So the classical sequence in Vedic understanding is one engages in religiosity, following a scriptural injunction to behave a certain way. The result is economic development. This lends some credence to the idea of prosperity gospel, but it's not quite the same thing. Prosperity gospel is God likes you and therefore he gives you money. Whereas this is a matter of you get a natural reaction from the universe by acting a certain way. In other words, it's a universal law of nature that good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is not. But to think in terms of prosperity gospel is a very materialistic conception of God, because God is, in the Vedic conception at least, is not so engaged in worldly affairs as the God of prosperity gospel. So it's a fine point, but I want to make sure that everyone understands it's not exactly the same thing. Sounds similar, but it's not the same thing. Okay, so you engage in good karma. You play by the rules and you get a reward. And the reward is the facility to enjoy material life. And then you have to do it again to maintain your enjoyment of material life. And then you have to do it again and again. And maybe you mess up. Maybe somewhere along the line you do something that undermines your good karma. Now you've got some bad karma mixed in. Maybe you develop a tendency that isn't actually going to generate good karma. It'll generate bad karma. And now you've got a downward spiral instead of an upward spiral, and then up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's just all so much work. And eventually you may get to the point where you think, you know, this isn't actually a very good deal. Maybe there's a way to step outside the system. Maybe there's some outside of the box thinking by which I can be free from this cycle of birth and death, good karma, bad karma, trying to enjoy the material world, and it never works out because no matter what I get, I always want more, or I lose what I have, or I die. And that's when one arrives at the point when one desires liberation. And so one aspires to liberation and acts in such a way for themselves to be liberated. And yes, there's still an ulterior motive there. There's still a selfish motive. It's just not a material selfish motive. It's a spiritual selfish motive, which is better than a material selfish motive. But now we have to ask, how does one get beyond any kind of selfish motive completely? Is there something beyond liberation? Cliffhanger. Thank you for your question, Kate. We will proceed and we will see if we find something greater than liberation, that is beyond even the desire to be free from one's karma. All right. There are three kinds of seekers of the truth. Coming back now to this verse. Others who offer themselves in the fire of sacrifice to the absolute truth. So now you've got three categories of truth seekers. Those who try to understand the absolute truth by the power of intellectual insight and study of revealed scriptures that describe the absolute truth. Those who try to understand the absolute truth by meditation and mysticism, and those who try to understand the absolute truth by devotion, by Bhakti Yoga. So those who are speculating on or engaged in philosophical speculation, Jnana Yoga, yoga of knowledge. Meditators, those who are trying to find the truth by meditation, those are Ashtanga yogis or mystic yogis. And then Bhakti yogis seek the absolute truth by devotion. And each of these three access a different aspect of the same one absolute truth, because the absolute truth is singular by definition, has to be. And yet, it is described as having three aspects, and throughout the Bhagavad-gita, we will find all three of these aspects being referred to. The first one is Brahman, or the spiritual energy of which everything is ultimately made. This is the impersonal aspect of the absolute truth, the glow of the absolute truth, the light of the absolute truth that jnana yogis or Vedantists seek to merge into. And so in the liberated state, one can basically head to the exits of the material world and merge into the undifferentiated oneness of Brahman. Then the second kind of yogi, the mystic yogi, is once they get past meditation on different aspects of material nature in order to gain mystic powers, what Patanjali actually encourages them to do is focus on Ishvara, the supreme person. Param Atma is the other word for this that's applicable in this sense. So Atma means soul, Param Atma means the paramount soul or the super soul. And that person, Ishvara, that exceptional, unique person who is omniscient, all-knowing, and all-pervading, is understood to reside within the heart of each Atma. So you've got a self who is in illusion, another self who is the person under the influence of illusion. I'll make that a little more clear. We have a conception of identity, and that conception of identity, as we learned in the earlier portions of the Gita, is actually composed of a combination of the three qualities of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance, that come together to form a particular personality and a particular body that goes with that personality, etc. And we identify with that and think that's me. So there's the illusory self that is actually made of the modes of material nature. Then there's the self who's experiencing that illusion, who for all intents and purposes is checked out, asleep. Yoga wakes the senses of that person up. And then the third self, the one with the capital S, is the Paramatma, the self within the heart of the self that is currently sleeping and dreaming that they are the combination of the modes of material nature that they identify with. The yogi seeks to wake up the spiritual senses and the process for doing so is to look for that supreme being, Ishvara, by chanting mantra meditation in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. The recommended mantra is Om, its repetition and contemplation of its meaning. And through that meditation, one eventually comes to see that supreme person within the heart. Then finally, the Bhakti Yogis, their focus is the third aspect of the absolute truth, which is Bhagavan, personal form of the supreme being. There's another text, another Vedic literature called the Srimad Bhagavatam that describes these three aspects of the one absolute truth as Brahmiti, Paramatmiti, Bhagavan iti shabdite. Learned transcendentalists who know the absolute truth call this non-dual absolute truth Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So Bhagavan is the personal form of the supreme person who facilitates relationship, particularly a relationship of love. And all of these different kinds of yoga can be thought of as a ladder that ultimately roll up to this idea of personal relationship expressed through service, motivated by love between the individual Atma and the supreme person, or Bhagavan, that aspect of the supreme absolute truth that facilitates this kind of relationship. And when one arrives at the point where one's consciousness is so purified that the only motivation one has for action is the pleasure of Bhagavan and is experiencing the pleasure of making a sacrificial offering simply for the pleasure of that supreme person, then one rises above the motivation to be liberated. Liberation actually just sort of comes with the package in Bhakti Yoga. So Bhakti Yoga includes and subsumes all of the other kinds of yoga that are discussed in the Bhagavad-gita, because Brahman realization, Paramatma realization, they're included in realization of Bhagavan, which comes about through this process of devotion. And this is called a dramatic pause, as I ensure that my computer does not run out of gas. I'm putting in a call to technical support in order to ensure that we stay on the air. Okay, any questions about, and now, by the way, you have the answer to Kate's question, what is beyond liberation? And if you have any other questions, please send them my way. Meanwhile, we'll move on. Some, now this is now going into verse 26, some monastics offer their senses, such as the sense of hearing, into the fire of complete self-discipline. Others, householders, offer the objects of the senses, such as sound, into the fire of the senses. So here Krishna is making a distinction between renunciates, rare, and people who are engaged in family life, not so rare. A lot of people doing that. And it is not as if yoga is just for monastics, not just for renunciates. Those who are inclined to take up a monastic life spend their time hearing about the absolute truth. And I recently saw a nice quote from Thomas Merton about how the life of monasticism is actually a statement. It makes a social statement of rejection of everything in the world and everything that is wrong with the world. And so in that sense, yes, I kind of agree that that is also an action. Hold on, I'm going to call tech support because the necessity of getting their attention has come up. Text message didn't work. Hey, is this tech support? Well, I need tech support because I'm running out of gas on my computer. Okay, thanks very much. Here comes tech support. Those who are engaged in monastic life make a statement, to be sure, and those who are engaged in family life, rather than just renouncing the world altogether, what they renounce is the objects of the senses that they acquire in the course, thank you, of working in the world, which is to say, you know, keep life simple, not monastic simple, but still simple. Moving on, text 27. Still others, being motivated by the desire for self-realization, offer the functions of all their organs, along with the actions of the breath of life, into the fire of yoga, which is kindled by perfect mental discipline. So here, Krishna is really talking about the yoga system of Patanjali, and specifically pranayama. So the word he uses here is pranakarmani, the actions of prana, the actions of the life force or the breath of life, are offered along with all of the other physical functions of the body. So in the yoga system, the phrase pratyag atma is used to describe the objective, and pratyahara is the system of turning the senses inward in order to arrive at the state of pratyag atma, that is to say, everything turning inward, disengaged from external objects, and looking inward for the ultimate goal or the highest truth. So that means all of the external senses don't engage with the external objects of the senses, but rather are engaged turning inward, and all of the vayus, pranavayu, samanavayu, udanavayu, all those vayus are all engaged in the search for the Paramatma, the supreme self within the heart of the self. That's some pretty fancy pranayama, probably more than you heard about in your yoga teacher training. But that's the kind of pranayama that Krishna is describing in the Bhagavad-gita, very advanced science of yoga. All right, text 28. Some sacrifice their worldly possessions through acts of charity. Okay, that's pretty clear. Some sacrifice material comforts through acts of austerity, tapasya. Some perform sacrifices of the eightfold path of mysticism, just in general, and some perform sacrifices by accepting severe vows of asceticism, acquiring self-knowledge through the engagement of svadhyaya, scriptural study. So the abandonment of everything other than the search for the truth. Text 29. Still others practice control of the breath. Now this is some pretty fancy pranayama coming up here, offering their incoming breath into the outgoing breath and their outgoing breath into the incoming breath. And others sacrifice the act of eating and suspend their breath altogether, thus sacrificing their own vital force. So this is really cool because a pranayama yogi, someone who's really doing this at a seriously high end, what they're doing in yoga, our duration of life is calculated not by hours and days and months and years, but by number of breaths. So if you can sustain your life force in your body while suspending your breath, you increase your duration of life. This is, you hear stories of like yogis in the forest who are hundreds of years old who come out for Kumbh Mela, you know, once every 12 years or something. This is how they do it. And it's a very, very advanced kind of pranayama where you gain so much control of your life force that you can actually suspend your breathing. And in this way, you have the time to perfect your life in this lifetime rather than just rolling the dice that you'll be able to keep it together and continue in your next life. Text 30, though engaged in different methods, all these performers understand the purpose of sacrifice and become purified by such performance. Having tasted the nectar of sacrificial remnants, they advance toward the supreme and eternal truth. So, this reflects back a little bit on a previous verse where Krishna said, however one approaches me, I reciprocate with them in exactly that way. So all these different angles of sacrifice, all of these different things, every performer of sacrifice understands the goal of their sacrifice and understands that they will be purified by this act of sacrifice. And that the experience of that sacrifice is a higher level of experience than the experience of trying to enjoy the world. Now remember, Arjuna's argument for not fighting. One of his objections was, this is not going to be fun. I'm not going to enjoy this, and neither is anyone else. And Krishna is telling him here that the experience you will have from performing your duty as an act of sacrifice is higher than the experience you would have if you tried to enjoy the results of your actions. So remember, this is still all playing into an argument that Krishna is making in order to convince Arjuna he should fight. And so here now he's going to start to close in on this portion of his argument. O best of the Kuru dynasty, Arjuna, one cannot live happily in this world without engaging in sacrifice. What to speak of the next? Meaning, if you want to have things go well in your next life, you have to perform sacrifice in this life. And even if you want things to go well in this life, you have to perform sacrifice. So what to speak of what you're going to do to prepare for your next life. Thus, the next verse, 32, various kinds of sacrifices emanate from the mouth of sacred texts. They are all born of action. Knowing them in this way, you shall be liberated. Now, this is a verse that has a few different translations to the phrase. The Sanskrit in the phrase is vitata brahmano mukhe. So mukhe means mukha, face. And Brahman is being referred to, therefore, the face of Brahman. So you can say, in one way of looking at this verse, that these sacrifices are emanations from the mouth of Brahman, or in other words, the Vedas, sacred texts. Another way to look at it is the reverse, that sacrifices are offered into, are consumed by Brahman. So they go into the mouth of Brahman. It indicates the arena of sacrifice in which a ritualistic offering to the absolute truth would be made in the Vedic tradition. So that's two ways. You may have different translations, and right about here is where the different groupings of the text may come about. So if you have a different translation that says it's not the emanation from the mouth of Brahman, it's what goes into the mouth of Brahman. Well, it can actually be translated either way, and both are valid. Text 33, hey, we're going to squeeze this in. Oh, scorcher of foes. See, now Krishna is trying to get Arjuna revved up again as he heads towards the finish line here. A sacrifice of knowledge is greater than a sacrifice of worldly possessions, for all acts of sacrifice culminate in knowledge. So, depending, without the elevation of knowledge, all of sacrifice are just going to be material activities. But when a sacrifice is elevated by virtue of performance in transcendental knowledge, then all of the activities are elevated to the spiritual platform. The purpose of all sacrifices is to arrive at the point of purification or knowledge, or the ability to experience transcendental knowledge, not just understand it as theory, but to actually experience it. It is a purification of the senses themselves that takes place when we engage in acts of sacrifice. So there you have it. I share my screen one more time, and we look at tonight's program. Knowledge of sacrifice. We looked at different varieties of sacrifice, and the different varieties of performers of sacrifice. We looked at the different techniques of sacrifice, the different kinds of things that one can sacrifice, and the objective of sacrifice, the different objectives of sacrifices, depending on what your motivation is. Covered verses 24 through 33. I ask you again for your questions. So please state your question in the form of a question, if you have a question, for me. And if you have any questions after the fact, which is to say if a question comes up later, or if you are watching this later and you have a question, then please do not hesitate. Hari@harikirtan.com is where you can find me. I am always sitting on the edge of my seat, anxiously waiting to hear from you. And here's something I know you'll want to know about. I will be participating in a panel discussion on the future of the yoga teacher. This is an ongoing panel discussion with several different groups of people that are going on through this month. I will be on the last panel discussion to discuss Yoga Teacher as Spiritual Guide. That'll be on August 15th at 10 a.m. You can go to embodiedphilosophy.com/future to register. It's free. It's free. Best price in town. Anyway, I will be on this panel with my friend Pranada Comtois, and she is also a expert. Actually, not also an expert. She's an actual expert in the topic of what it means to be a spiritual guide. I'm just going to pretend. Later this month, I will be in upstate New York, beautiful Saratoga Springs. Yoga Mandali has been kind enough to invite me, or to accept the fact that I invited myself, to come up to their beautiful studio and speak about integrating yoga philosophy into classes and workshops. This is a workshop for yoga teachers. If you are up in the New York State, Saratoga Springs area, I would love to see you there. And there are only 2 more weeks to register for my 300-hour yoga teacher training program. You can go to my website under Work With Me Teacher Training to get all the details. I will be offering this 300-hour advanced teacher training with my good friend Ashley Lateki-Ellenboss up at Sky House Yoga in Silver Spring. 2 courses that we're offering also run as standalone courses. So if you're interested in pranayama, if you want to learn how to offer your outgoing breath into the incoming and the incoming breath into the outgoing and suspend your breath altogether, then come and take this course with Braja Kishori. She is expert at the advanced practices of pranayama. We specifically wanted to offer this course because it is so rare to have someone who really knows pranayama. So that 24-hour course runs from September 29th to February 9th. It's 24 hours, not like one day, 24 hours. It's spread out. You can go to my website and get the complete schedule. We'll also be doing a standard economy. Also, expert last year spread out from September 30th through March 10th. So please go to my website and sign up today. Next week, we will continue. Actually, we will conclude. No, we will almost conclude chapter 4. We're heading into the last portion of the chapter. So this will be a summation of the knowledge of sacrifice. We'll talk about the traditional method by which one understands sacrifices. That is to say, the system for the transmission of knowledge. And we will also speak about the results of knowledge and the alternatives to knowledge, which, spoiler alert, they won't be that good. Verses 34 through 40 in chapter 4. And there you have it. Any last questions? I would be happy to entertain them. And if not, well then, I will say good evening to you all. Thank you very, very much for spending this time with me. I am always honored by your presence and thrilled to be here with you. I hope you've had a good time and that now you know how to engage in a sacrifice. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. In Meeting for All.